And now we have bone tissue, one of our connective tissues. As you know, our bone allows for support. That's why we are not giant blobs of tissue. It allows us to sit upright, have structure. It protects our internal organs, for example, the skull or the ribs, almost completely enclose some of our organs. Along with our muscle, it allows for movement of our body. And then some other things you may not know about the skeletal system is that this is where we store excess calcium, excess phosphorus. This is where blood cells are produced, which is called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. And it's also an area where we may store triglycerides. I should note that this is an adult bone. We'll get to it. There are 5 different types of bones. A bone that you would give a dog is considered a long bone because it's long. A bone that kind of looks like a square would be considered a short bone. These are, basically the bones in your wrist. Flat bones are flat. And the reason why we separate these types of bones, by the way, is because they actually grow differently. You now know that we began as a cartilage model, and so the way that the bone replaces cartilage is different for flat bones and long bones. An irregular bone is irregular. So, the bones of the vertebrae are, for example, irregular. They don't really fit any of the others. And then a bone that looks like a sesame seed is called a sesamoid bone. And really, that's just your patella. So it's in our flat bones, like our oscoxa of the hips, our sternum, our scapula, that hematopoiesis or hemopoiesis occurs. And it also occurs within the spongy bone, so as we will see in the ends of our long bones. And this is occurring by a type of tissue called red bone marrow. And by the way, this is in adults. In infants, red bone marrow actually is found all over the place. So inside the middle of long bones, as well as in the middle of flat bones. In adults, however, they're only in these areas, so hematopoiesis only occurs in these areas. So we'll quickly go over the structure of the long bone, but you are going over this in lab. So the ends of a bone are called the epiphyses, and so we can use those anatomical terms that you've learned to describe the proximal end and the distal end. And here we have the humerus. In the middle, we have the diaphysis, and as you can see, it's made out of different types of bones. On the epiphyses, we have spongy bone. It's called that because it looks spongy. Notice that it has red bone marrow there. Whereas in the diaphysis, we have compact bone. The bone is much more compact, much more condensed in these areas, and so it's much sturdier. So when do bones stop increasing in length? Recall that we were just talking about the cartilage model in connective tissue, and in growing bones, and that's under the age of 18 for females, under the age of 21 for males, there's this line here called the epiphyseal plate, and this is still cartilage for the growing young person. Once you pass that age, though, 18 or 21, this epiphyseal plate actually ossifies and is replaced with bone, and now it's called the epiphyseal line. So, quick question here. This X-ray depicts the left shoulder of a murder victim, and the estimated age for epiphyseal closing at the proximal end of the humerus was about 10 to 15 years ago. What predictions can you make about the age of the victim? So notice that there is a connective tissue covering on the outside and the inside of our long bones, the periosteum and the endosteum. This is dense regular connective tissue that covers our long bone. Covers our other bones too. I shouldn't say that. And then there is articular cartilage that is covering the ends of our long bones, and they're shown in like a light blue color. And again, this is evidence of that cartilage model that we had as a fetus. This reduces friction between joints and surfaces. Notice that inside the diaphysis we have a cavity called the medullary cavity. Remember that the word medulla means the middle of something, and it's hollow inside. And again, for young babies or infants or children, it contains red marrow, which is the site of hematopoiesis. But for adults, it's going to contain yellow marrow. Perhaps you've ever eaten the bone marrow of cow, right? Of beef bone marrow. And that would have been yellow bone marrow, and it's like a really fatty bite. As we zoom in, we have these units that are like trunks of a tree called osteons. At the very center, we have blood vessels, and our bone can't grow over blood vessels. And notice there is no movement of the vessels inside, and so our compact bone grow around these vessels. And so this opening is called the central canal or the Haversian canal. And we have bone growing around our blood vessels here. Notice that our blood vessels, of course, have to connect. And so this is a perforating canal between two central canals. And it's in these spaces that carry blood vessels as well as nerves. And so this is the ground substance of our bone. And notice there's these teeny little hack marks, they look like little bugs kind of. And it's in those little dots where we have lacuna, but now these lacuna are filled with osteocytes. So here is just one pie slice of an osteon. One of these concentric rings are called lamella, and notice that you have osteocytes within the lacuna. And they have to be able to interact with one another. They communicate with one another to talk about the structure or to communicate about the health of the bone, to help maintain bone tissue. And they do this via canaliculi. So canaliculi are these projections that come off of the osteocytes that help cells communicate with one another. So notice that spongy bone is the same. However, there are no osteons here. Instead of osteons, we have trabeculae. And so for me, trabeculae kind of look like deer horns. And this is what allows for red blood vessels to kind of form around the spongy bone. Notice that there are still osteocytes, still lacuna, still lamellae, still canaliculi. If we talk about our connective tissue video and our bone video, it kind of helps to talk about the different parts of words. I mentioned last time, cond means cartilage. Os or osteo means bone, like in osteoporosis. The word site, the root site, just means cell. And then there are some other ones here that I'm going to introduce to you. The word blast, it kind of sounds like it's going to break something, but blast in biology actually means something new. An example of that is like a blastula. Maybe you observed one of these in general biology. So these are growing, these are new, these are budding. Whereas the word clast is actually what means to break open or to kill. The word clast means to break apart. And then the root genic, like Genesis, means to begin. So now we're going to learn 4 different bone cells: osteogenic cells, osteoblasts, osteocytes, and osteoclasts. I'm going to talk about each difference between the 4 of them so that you should be able to distinguish between the 4. Osteogenic cells are the only bone cells that are capable of mitosis. Only ones. And they may differentiate into an osteoblast. An osteoblast is like a fibroblast in the bone. And so what it does is it secretes the cell matrix. It's going to secrete the extracellular matrix, which is our bone. And so you can imagine that it's kind of secreting and it's like laying down concrete, right? Because your bone is basically as firm as that. And eventually it's going to lay down so much concrete that it can no longer move. So these are movable. And then when they lay down so much concrete where they can no longer move, they have now matured into an osteocyte. An osteocyte does not move. And now it can't secrete any more extracellular matrix. So its job is just to maintain bone, to maintain the health of the bone. And again, it does that via the projections called canaliculi. So all 3 of these bone cells are related because they all came from the osteogenic cell. And then on the flip side of that, there is this 4th cell, the osteoclast, not related to these other 3. I mean, it's in bone, so it's related in that way, but it does not come from the osteogenic cell. In fact, it comes from fused white blood cells. And so it kind of has an immune system response. And what its job is to break down bone. It goes around and breaks down the extracellular matrix that the previous osteoblasts might have built up. So another way to show you this, osteogenic cells are kind of like the bone stem cell. They're the only ones that are capable of mitosis. They're created in the embryo, and we find them in the periosteum and the endosteum of long bones, of adult long bones, because that is where growth may occur. They may divide and they may turn into osteoblasts, bud and building, right? Their job is to secrete the extracellular matrix, just like the fibroblast of a connective tissue. These are going to secrete our extracellular matrix until they become surrounded and they can't move anymore. And now they have matured into osteocytes. Osteocytes' job is to maintain bone. They communicate with one another via canaliculi. And say if there was a place where there was damage, say if Jorge, played basketball on the weekends and he got a kick in the knee and got a hairline fracture, his bone cells, his osteocytes, would be able to communicate that, and these osteoclasts would come in and break down that bone and digest this bone. And what would happen next is that the osteoblasts would lay down new bone. This is called bone remodeling, and this is happening in bone all of the time. So what if osteoblasts are too active? Maybe you've heard of bone spurs before. where you might have an overgrowth or bumpy growth of bone. This is not a good thing. They can cause pain. They might happen in sites of injury. Not great. And then, this is an example over here of bone cancer, which shows really hyperactive osteoblasts. So when you exercise, that does have an effect on activating or deactivating your osteoblast activity and osteoclast activity. Weight-bearing exercises help you build and retain your bone mass, because I'm sure you've heard if you don't use it, you'll lose it. So if you get older and you're hitting 30, 35, 40, and you just exercise less and less and less, your bones are going to get less dense and less dense and less dense. And that's because the osteoblast activity will not keep up with the osteoclast activity. Another thing to think about with this aging and exercise is sex hormones diminish during middle age, which again, osteoclast activity is going to outpace osteoblast activity. But another thing is diet. So calcium in a diet. We mentioned earlier how our bone is storage of calcium. So if you don't get calcium in your body, if you don't eat calcium, if you don't get calcium in your diet, your body is going to get it another way, and it's going to get it by degrading your bone. And so all of this can increase the risk of osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is basically just really, really low bone density.